The photograph arrived in a brown envelope with no return address. Inside, a single image, black and white, edges curled with age. A cargo train, frozen in time, somewhere in Eastern Europe. Beneath it, handwritten in faded ink, March 14th, 1943, never arrived. I held it under the desk lamp for a long time, studying the faces of the men standing beside the train, young, tired, some smiling. None of them knew they were already ghosts. My grandfather was one of them. Second from the left, hands in his coat pockets, eyes looking directly at the camera. He died in 1956, never speaking about the war. My grandmother told me once that he woke up screaming some nights, calling out names no one recognized. She said he kept a notebook but burned it the week before he died. I never understood why, until now. The envelope had been sent to me by a woman named Clara Voss, a researcher in Berlin. She didn't explain how she found me, only that she had been tracing a military logistics report from 1943, and my grandfather's name appeared in the margins, not as a soldier, as a witness. The report was stamped, classified, indefinite. It described a weapons convoy, over 200 crates of rifles, ammunition, explosives, and something listed only as Material X. The convoy left a depot outside Krakow on March 12, 1943. It was supposed to reach a forward position near the Soviet front within 72 hours. No wreckage, never did. No ambush reports, no record of capture. It simply disappeared, and with it 43 men. The official file listed them as missing, presumed dead. But Clara believed otherwise. She believed they were silenced. I read her letter 3 times before I responded. She wanted to meet, said she had documents, testimonies, pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across decades. She said my grandfather had been there, not on the train, but at the depot, the night before it left. She said he saw something, and that seeing it may have saved his life, or ruined it. I booked a flight to Berlin the next morning, not because I expected answers, but because the photograph wouldn't let me sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there, hands in his pockets, staring into a camera as if he knew the future, as if he was trying to tell me something across 80 years of silence. Clara met me at a cafe near Potsdamer Platz. She was older than I expected, maybe 70, with sharp eyes and a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived the Cold War. She didn't shake my hand. She just slid a folder across the table. "This is everything I've found," she said quietly. "It's not much, but it's enough to ask the right questions." Inside were photocopies of transit logs, inventory lists, a partial map with routes marked in red, and a handwritten note dated March 13th, 1943. It read, "Do not proceed. Cargo compromised. Await further instruction." The signature was illegible, but someone had crossed it out in thick black ink. "Compromised how?" I asked. Clara leaned forward. "That's what no one will say. The depot was under German control. The convoy was staffed by Wehrmacht logistics personnel. Everything was routine, until it wasn't." "What changed?" She hesitated. "Someone opened one of the crates." I stared at her. And the next morning, the entire convoy was reassigned. New orders, new crew, issued directly from Berlin, bypassing regional command. Why? "Because whatever was in that crate," she said slowly, "was not supposed to be seen." I looked down at the photograph again. My grandfather, standing beside a train that would vanish into history. "He knew," I said. Clara nodded. "He knew, and he didn't go with them." "Why not?" She opened the briefcase and pulled out a small yellowed notebook. The cover was cracked, the pages brittle. "Because," she said, "someone told him to stay behind." She slid the notebook across the table. On the first page, in my grandfather's handwriting, March 13th. "Orders changed. Train leaves at dawn. I am not to board. God forgive me. I felt the air leave my lungs." "He was supposed to be on that train," I whispered. Clara's eyes were steady. "Yes, and someone made sure he wasn't." I turned the page. The next entry was dated 2 weeks later. "They are all dead. No one will speak of it. I have been warned. Once. There will not be a second time." The rest of the notebook was blank. I sat back, my hands trembling. "What was on that train?" I asked. Clara closed the briefcase. "That," she said, "is what we're going to find out." Outside, the city hummed with life. But inside that cafe, surrounded by ghosts and unanswered questions, I felt the weight of something vast and suffocating. A secret buried so deep, it had erased 43 men from existence. And my grandfather had carried it to his grave. Now it was mine to unearth. We left Berlin the following morning. Clara drove, an old Volkswagen that rattled on the highways and smelled faintly of cigarettes and old paper. She didn't talk much during the drive, and I didn't press her. I spent the hours reading through the documents she'd given me, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. But the more I read, the less sense it made. The convoy had been routine. Standard military logistics, weapons and supplies moving from a rear depot to forward positions near the Eastern Front. Nothing unusual, nothing classified. And yet, someone in Berlin had intervened personally, reassigning the crew and changing the route at the last possible moment. Why? The depot itself was located in what is now southern Poland, near the town of Tarnów. During the war, it had been a major logistics hub. Trains moving constantly, warehouses filled with everything from ammunition to medical supplies. After the war, it was abandoned. The Soviets stripped what they could, then left it to rot. By the time we arrived, it was little more than a shell, crumbling brick buildings, rusted rail tracks disappearing into overgrown weeds. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. Clara parked near the old gate and stepped out, pulling her coat tight against the wind. "This is it," she said quietly. I followed her through the gate, past collapsed fences and buildings with gaping windows. The place felt haunted. Not in a supernatural sense, but in the way places do when too much has been forgotten, when silence becomes a kind of violence. Clara led me to what had once been the main storage facility, a long, low building with a partially collapsed roof. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The floor was littered with debris, broken crates, rusted metal, shards of glass. Clara knelt beside a section of the floor where the concrete had cracked. She brushed away dirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper, laminated in plastic. "I found this last year," she said, handing it to me. It was a loading manifest, dated March 12, 1943. It listed the contents of the convoy in meticulous detail: 180 crates of Carabiner 98K rifles, 60 crates of ammunition, 12 crates of explosives, 8 crates of medical supplies. And at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, special cargo, 4 crates. Destination classified, handle with extreme caution. No description, no inventory code, just special cargo. "This is what they were hiding," I said. Clara nodded. 4 crates. No one knows what was inside, but whatever it was, it justified erasing an entire convoy from the record. I looked around the ruined depot, trying to imagine it as it had been. Soldiers moving crates onto flatbed rail cars, officers checking manifests, my grandfather standing somewhere in this space, watching. "Did he write anything else?" I asked. "In the notebook?" Clara shook her head. "Only what you've seen. But I found something else." She led me outside to the far edge of the depot where the rail tracks used to run. There was a small, unmarked concrete structure half buried in the ground, a bunker maybe, or a storage vault. The door was rusted shut. Clara pulled a crowbar from her bag and wedged it into the gap. Together we pried it open. The smell hit us first. Stale air, decades old. Inside was darkness. Clara pulled out a flashlight and stepped in. I followed. The bunker was small, maybe 10 feet across. The walls were bare concrete, stained with moisture, but in the center of the floor, someone had carved words into the stone. Deep, deliberate letters. I knelt beside them, running my fingers over the grooves. They lied. It was never weapons. JM. JM, I whispered. Clara crouched beside me. Joseph Müller. He was the depot commander. He signed the original manifest. What happened to him? He was found dead 3 weeks after the convoy disappeared. Official report said heart attack. I looked at her. "You don't believe that?" "No," she said, "I don't." We stood in silence, the weight of those carved words pressing down on us. It was never weapons. Then what was it? Clara exhaled slowly. There's one more place we need to go. Where? The route, she said. The train was supposed to pass through a village called Przeworsk. A local historian contacted me last year. Said his grandfather remembered the night the train came through. He saw it? No, Clara said. He heard it, and he said it didn't sound like a normal train. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean? Clara didn't answer. She just walked back toward the car, leaving me standing in the ruins of a place where secrets had been loaded onto a train that no longer existed. I looked back at the bunker one last time, at the words carved into the stone, and I wondered how many people had died to keep them hidden. Przeworsk was small. A cluster of houses along a two-lane road, a church with a crooked steeple, fields stretching out in every direction. It looked like time had stopped here sometime in the 1950s and never started again. Clara parked outside a modest house on the edge of the village. An old man was sitting on the porch, smoking a pipe. He watched us approach with the stillness of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. Clara spoke to him in Polish. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone, respectful, careful. The old man nodded slowly, then gestured for us to sit. His name was Piotr. He was 89 years old. His grandfather had been the station master here during the war. Clara translated as he spoke, his voice low and steady. The train came through on the night of March 14th, he said. My grandfather was expecting it. There were always supply trains moving east, but this one was different. How? I asked. Piotr took a long drag from his pipe. It didn't stop. It was supposed to stop. The schedule said 30 minutes for inspection and refueling, but it went straight through. Maybe they were running late, I suggested. Piotr shook his head. No. My grandfather said the engineer looked afraid. He was leaning out of the cab, waving his arms, shouting something, but the train didn't slow down. Clara leaned forward. What was he shouting? Piotr's eyes darkened. My grandfather couldn't hear the words, but he heard the sound. What sound? From inside the cargo cars. A long silence. What kind of sound? I asked quietly. Piotr stared out at the fields. Humming, he said. Like machinery, but deeper. Like it was coming from underground. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Humming, I repeated. My grandfather said it made his teeth ache. He had to cover his ears until the train passed. Clara and I exchanged a glance. Did anyone else hear it? She asked. Everyone in the village heard it, Piotr said, but no one talked about it, not after the soldiers came. What soldiers? 2 days later, SS. They went door to door asking questions, wanting to know if anyone had seen the train, if anyone had tried to stop it. Had they? No. Everyone was too afraid. Piotr leaned back, his expression unreadable. The soldiers told my grandfather to burn the station logs, said if anyone asked, the train never came through. He paused, but my grandfather didn't burn them. Clara sat up straighter. He kept them. Piotr nodded. He hid them, thought maybe one day someone would come asking the right questions. He stood slowly, walked inside, and returned a moment later with a small wooden box. He handed it to Clara. Inside were yellowed papers, brittle with age. Clara carefully unfolded one. It was a rail schedule, stamped and signed. She read aloud, translating, Train 47K, departed Tarnów 06 Urejsau. Expected Przeworsk 14:30, status, passed without stop, no inspection conducted. Cargo, unknown. Destination, unconfirmed. And at the bottom, in hurried handwriting, sound reported. Notify command, do not approach. I looked at Piotr. Your grandfather wrote that? Yes. Did he ever find out what happened to the train? Piotr shook his head. No. But 3 weeks later, a man came to the village. He asked to speak with my grandfather privately. What did he want? He said the train had been destroyed. An accident, he called it. Said everyone aboard was dead. Did your grandfather believe him? Piotr's expression hardened. No, because the man was lying. My grandfather could see it in his eyes. He tapped his pipe against the railing, scattering ash into the wind. The man said something else too, something my grandfather never forgot. What? Piotr's voice dropped to almost a whisper. He said, "Some cargo is not meant to arrive. It is meant to disappear." The words hung in the air like smoke. Clara closed the box carefully. "Did your grandfather ever see that man again?" "No, but he had nightmares for years. He said he could still hear the humming, even decades later." We sat in silence, the wind moving through the trees. I thought about my grandfather standing at the depot, watching that train being loaded, watching men climb aboard, not knowing they were already dead. And I thought about the humming, the sound that made teeth ache, the sound that came from cargo no one was meant to see. Clara stood, thanking Piotr quietly. He nodded, but said nothing more. As we walked back to the car, I looked back at the village, at the fields stretching endlessly under a grey sky, and I wondered how many other places like this existed. Small, forgotten corners of the world where the war had left its scars, not in ruins or monuments, but in silence, in the things people were too afraid to say out loud. Clara started the engine. "Where now?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, "There's a physicist in Vienna. He worked on experimental weapons during the war, magnetic systems, acoustic devices, black projects. I think he knows something," Clara said slowly, "that if anyone knows what could hum like that, it's him." We drove away from Przeworsk as the sun began to set, and behind us, in that small village, an old man sat on his porch, smoking his pipe, listening to a sound only he could still hear. Vienna felt different, alive in a way the depot and the village had not been. Streets filled with people, cafes spilling onto sidewalks, the hum of a city that had learned to forget. But Clara and I were not here for the present. We were here for a man named Dr. Emil Kovar. He lived in a quiet district on the outskirts of the city, in an apartment building that looked like it had been standing since before the war. Clara had called ahead. He was expecting us. The door opened before we knocked. Dr. Kovar was small, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that trembled slightly as he gestured us inside. He didn't offer pleasantries, just led us into a cluttered study filled with books, papers and diagrams pinned to the walls, equations I couldn't begin to understand. "You want to know about the sound?" he said, not as a question. Clara nodded. "We were told you worked on experimental weapons, acoustic systems." Dr. Kovar sat down heavily, his eyes distant. "I worked on many things I wish I hadn't." He poured himself a glass of water, his hands shaking. "What did the witness describe?" he asked. "A humming," I said. "Deep, continuous, made his teeth ache." Dr. Kovar closed his eyes. "Resonance," he murmured. "What?" "Resonance frequency. Every material has one, a frequency at which it vibrates naturally. If you apply the correct sound wave, you can make it vibrate uncontrollably, shatter glass, crack concrete." He looked at me. "Or disrupt human tissue." I felt my stomach turn. "You're saying they weaponized sound?" "Not successfully," Dr. Kovar said quickly. "The technology wasn't there, not in 1943. But we tried." Clara leaned forward. "Who is we?" Dr. Kovar hesitated. "There was a research division, unofficial, operated out of Berlin, but the work was done in remote facilities. They called it Project Nachthall, Project Echo. What was its purpose? To develop non-conventional weapons, things that couldn't be traced back to explosives or bullets, acoustic disruptors, magnetic pulse devices, frequency generators." He paused. Most of it was theoretical, but there was one prototype. "What kind of prototype?" Dr. Kovar stood, walking to a filing cabinet in the corner. He pulled out a folder, old and worn, and laid it on the desk. Inside were technical drawings, blueprints of a device I didn't recognize. It looked like a large cylinder, maybe 6 feet tall, with coils wrapped around the exterior and a series of panels on the sides. "We called it the Glock, the bell," Dr. Kovar said quietly. "It was supposed to generate a controlled resonance field, low frequency, high amplitude. Theoretically, it could incapacitate anyone within a 100-meter radius." "Did it work?" His expression darkened. "I don't know. I left the project before the final tests." Why? He looked at me, his eyes haunted. Because the lead scientist disappeared, and the facility was shut down overnight. No explanation, just erased. Clara's voice was steady. When? March 1943. The room went silent. I stared at the blueprint, my mind racing. You think this was on the train? Dr. Kovar nodded slowly. If the device was being transported, and if it was active, the sound you described matches the resonance signature. Why would it be active during transport? I asked. It shouldn't have been, unless something went wrong. Clara leaned back, her expression grim, or unless someone wanted it to be. Dr. Kovar looked at her sharply. What do you mean? If the device was experimental, Clara said, and if it malfunctioned, who would know? Who would investigate? No one, Dr. Kovar whispered, because officially it never existed. I felt a cold certainty settle over me. They weren't transporting it to the front, I said. They were getting rid of it. A train full of men, a device that was too dangerous to keep, and a route through empty countryside where no one would ask questions. A disposal mission, I said. Dr. Kovar's hands clenched into fists. They killed their own people. Not killed, Clara said quietly. Erased. The three of us sat in silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down. Dr. Kovar finally spoke, his voice barely audible. There's something else you should know. We waited, the lead scientist on the project. His name was Müller, Josef Müller. My blood went cold. The depot commander. Dr. Kovar nodded. He wasn't just a logistics officer. He was a physicist, one of the best. He designed the bell. I looked at Clara. That's why he was there. That's why he knew. She nodded slowly. And that's why he was killed. Dr. Kovar stood, walking to the window, staring out at the city. I have spent 70 years trying to forget what I was part of, he said, trying to convince myself that the work we did was theoretical, harmless. He turned to face us. But I knew, we all knew, some things are not meant to be built. Then why did you? I asked. He smiled bitterly. Because we were told we had no choice. Because we were scientists, and science does not ask moral questions. He paused. It should have. Clara gathered the documents, carefully placing them back in the folder. Is there anything else you can tell us? Anything that might help us find out what happened to the train? Dr. Kovar thought for a long moment. There was a second facility, he said, east of here, in what is now Ukraine. It was used for field testing. Do you know where? He shook his head. Only that it was near the front lines, remote, heavily guarded. He looked at me. If your grandfather knew about the bell, if he saw it being loaded onto that train, then someone decided he was a threat. But they didn't kill him, I said. No, Dr. Kovar agreed. They let him live, which means they wanted him to carry the fear, to remember, to never speak. He leaned closer. Fear is a more effective silence than death. We left Vienna as the sun set, the city lights flickering to life behind us, and I thought about my grandfather, living for 40 years with a secret he could never tell, waking up screaming, burning his notebook, dying with the weight of it still crushing him. I wondered if he ever tried to forget, or if he knew deep down that some things are impossible to erase. Clara didn't tell me where we were going next, just that we needed to cross into Ukraine. It took us 3 days, trains, buses, back roads through small towns that barely existed on maps. By the time we arrived, I had stopped asking questions. The archive was located in a former Soviet military facility outside Lviv. It had been converted into a research center after the fall of the USSR, but it still looked like a place designed to keep people out. High fences, security cameras, a single guarded entrance. Clara knew someone inside, a historian named Dmitri, who had spent decades cataloging documents the Soviets had seized after the war. He met us in a windowless room deep inside the building, surrounded by filing cabinets and boxes stacked floor to ceiling. "You're looking for German records," he said in accented English. "Specifically, weapons research." Clara nodded. "Project Nachthol. Any reference to transport or disposal operations in March 1943. Dmitri's expression didn't change. "That project is difficult." "Difficult how?" I asked. Because most of the records were destroyed. By the Germans before the Soviets arrived, and by the Soviets after they did. Why would the Soviets destroy them? Dmitri smiled faintly, because they wanted the technology for themselves, and they didn't want anyone to know where it came from. He stood, moving to a cabinet in the corner. But some things survive. Not much, but enough. He pulled out a single folder, thin and worn. Inside were a handful of documents, mostly fragments, pages torn or burned at the edges, but one caught my eye. A transport order dated March 10th, 1943. It read, "Authorization granted for special convoy. Cargo, experimental apparatus. Route, Tarnov, Przeworsk, Ternopil. Final destination, Facility 19. Facility 19, I said. What is that? Dmitri shook his head. I don't know. It's mentioned in several documents, but there's no location, no description, just a designation. He pulled out another sheet. But I found this. It was a handwritten report, dated April 2nd, 1943. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. Inspection of convoy wreckage completed. No survivors. Device recovered, but non-functional. Recommend immediate burial and site containment. I stared at the page. Wreckage, I whispered. Clara leaned closer. Where? Dmitri pointed to a set of coordinates scrawled at the bottom of the page. 60 kilometers east of Ternopil. He looked at us. But I should warn you, the area is unstable. Landmines, unexploded ordnance. The war never really left that part of the country. Clara didn't hesitate. We're going. Dmitri sighed. I thought you might say that. He handed her a second folder. These are maps, old Soviet military surveys. They might help you navigate. He paused. But if you find something, be careful. Some secrets were buried for a reason. We thanked him and left. The drive east was long and tense. The roads deteriorated the further we went, paved highways giving way to dirt tracks, scarred by decades of neglect. The landscape was flat, empty, fields stretching endlessly under a grey sky. Every so often we passed ruins, crumbling farmhouses, burned-out vehicles, rusted barbed wire half buried in the earth, ghosts of a war that had never really ended. We reached the coordinates just before dusk. There was nothing there. Just a clearing in a sparse forest, overgrown with weeds and brambles. Clara parked the car and stepped out, holding the map. This is it, she said. I looked around. There's nothing here. That's the point. She walked into the clearing, moving slowly, her eyes scanning the ground. I followed, my heart pounding. And then I saw it, a depression in the earth. Not natural, too uniform, too deliberate, like something had been buried here and the ground had slowly collapsed over it. Clara knelt beside it, brushing away dirt and leaves. Beneath, the soil was darker, stained. Oil, she murmured, or something like it. She dug deeper with her hands and then stopped. Her fingers had found something solid, metal. We both started digging, pulling away years of dirt and decay. And slowly, piece by piece, the shape emerged. A cargo crate, half collapsed, rusted through in places, but intact enough to see the markings stenciled on the side. Project Nachthol. Nicht öffnen. Do not open. Clara sat back, breathing hard. This is it, she whispered. This is where they buried it. I stared at the crate, my hands trembling. Do we open it? Clara hesitated. Then she nodded. Together we pried at the edges, the metal groaning and splitting under the pressure. The lid came free with a sharp crack. Inside was darkness. Clara pulled out her flashlight and shone it into the crate. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Twisted metal, shattered glass, wires fused together by heat or time, and in the center, partially intact, a cylindrical object wrapped in coils. The bell, but it was broken, warped and scorched, as if something had torn it apart from the inside. Clara reached in, carefully lifting a piece of metal. On the underside, etched in small letters, was a serial number, and beneath it, a name, Josef Müller. I felt the air leave my lungs. He built this, I said, and then he tried to destroy it. Clara replied. We stood in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on us. This was the cargo, this was the secret, a weapon that had never worked, a project that had consumed lives and resources and hope, only to fail. And rather than admit the failure, they had buried it, erased it, killed everyone who knew. Why not just scrap it? I asked. Why go through all this? Clara looked at me. Because failure is worse than secrecy. Admitting the device didn't work would have meant admitting the entire project was a waste, and in 1943, with the war turning against them, they couldn't afford that. She placed the metal piece back in the crate carefully, so they made it disappear, and everyone with it. I thought about the men on that train, 43 soldiers sent to die for a lie. And I thought about my grandfather standing at the depot, watching them leave, knowing what was in those crates, knowing he should have been with them, and knowing he could never speak of it. Clara closed the crate, covering it again with dirt. We should go, she said quietly, but I didn't move. I stood there, staring at the burial site, feeling the enormity of what had been hidden here, not just a failed weapon, but the lie that came after, the silence that followed. The decades of pretending it never existed, and I realized that this was the real legacy of the war, not the battles or the victories, but the secrets, the things that were buried so deep, even the earth couldn't hold them anymore. We drove away as night fell, and behind us, in that empty clearing, the bell remained, broken, forgotten, but never truly gone. We didn't speak for hours after leaving the burial site. The weight of what we'd found pressed down like stone. Clara drove through the night, her hands tight on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road. I kept seeing the crate, the twisted metal, the name etched beneath the serial number, Joseph Müller, a physicist who became a depot commander, a man who built a weapon, then tried to bury it, and paid for that choice with his life. But something still didn't fit. If Müller designed the bell, I said quietly, breaking the silence, why was he stationed at the depot? Why wasn't he with the convoy? Clara didn't answer immediately. Then, because he refused. I looked at her. What do you mean? She exhaled slowly. I didn't want to tell you until I was sure, but there's a report, buried deep in the Soviet archives, an interrogation transcript. Of who? A German officer, captured in 1945. He was questioned about secret weapons programs. She glanced at me. He mentioned Müller, said he was removed from the project in early 1943 after he tried to sabotage it. I felt my chest tighten. Sabotage how? He tried to disable the device before it could be tested, said it was too dangerous, that if it malfunctioned, it could kill everyone within range. Then why not just destroy it? Because he didn't have the authority, and when he went over his superior's head to request the project be shut down, they reassigned him, sent him to the depot, told him if he spoke again, he'd be executed. I stared out the window, the dark countryside rolling past. So they made him load it onto the train, I said. Made him watch it leave. Yes, and then they killed him anyway. Clara nodded. 3 weeks later, because he knew too much, because he'd tried to stop it. I leaned my head back against the seat, my mind racing. What about my grandfather? Where does he fit into this? Clara was silent for a long moment. I think, she said carefully, that Müller told him. Told him what? Everything. What the device was. What would happen if it activated during transport. Why the men on that train were already dead. She paused. And I think your grandfather was supposed to go with them, but Müller pulled him off the manifest. I felt a chill run through me. Why would he do that? Because your grandfather wasn't part of the project. He was just a logistics officer. Innocent. Clara's voice softened. And maybe Müller couldn't save everyone, but he could save one. I closed my eyes, the full weight of it settling over me. My grandfather hadn't been spared by luck. He'd been saved. By a man who knew he was going to die, a man who chose to carry the guilt alone rather than let one more person suffer for it. He lived with that, I whispered, knowing Müller died to save him. Yes, and he could never tell anyone. No, because if he did, He'd be signing his own death warrant. I opened my eyes, staring at the ceiling of the car. That's why he burned the notebook. Clara nodded. He carried it as long as he could, but in the end, even the words were too dangerous. We drove in silence after that. The road stretched on, empty and dark, but my mind was full of questions, full of grief, full of anger at the men who had decided that silence was more valuable than truth. We stopped in a small town just before dawn, a single street place with a gas station and a cafe that looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years. Clara went inside to get coffee. I stayed in the car, staring at the folder on the dashboard. Inside were all the pieces we'd gathered: the photograph, the manifest, the transport orders, the interrogation transcript, and beneath them all, the small, yellowed notebook, my grandfather's notebook. I opened it again, reading the entries I'd already memorized. March 13th, orders changed. Train leaves at dawn. I am not to board. God forgive me. They are all dead. No one will speak of it. I have been warned. Once. There will not be a second time. And then, on the last page, something I hadn't noticed before. A single line, written in a different hand. Smaller, shakier. Tell them it was never weapons. Tell them we tried to stop it. J.M. Joseph Müller. He had written in my grandfather's notebook. A final message. A confession. A plea. I sat there, the notebook trembling in my hands, and I felt something break inside me. Not sadness, not anger, just recognition that this was what the war had done. Not just to soldiers on battlefields, but to men like Müller, like my grandfather, men who had tried to do the right thing and been crushed by the machinery of silence. Clara returned with 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one, then noticed the notebook in my lap. "You found something," she said. I showed her the line. She read it, then closed her eyes. "He wanted the truth to survive," she said quietly. "But no one listened. Someone did." I looked at her. "Your grandfather listened, and now you're listening. And because of that, the truth didn't die with them." She sat down beside me. "That's what we're doing here. We're finishing what they started." I took a sip of the coffee, letting the heat steady me. "Where do we go from here?" Clara pulled out the map. "There's one more place. The field testing site. Dr. Kovar mentioned it, east of here, near the old front lines. You think there's something there?" "I think if they tested the device, there might be records, witnesses, something that proves it wasn't just a failed experiment." She looked at me. "Something that proves it killed people." I nodded slowly. "Then we go." We finished our coffee in silence, then got back in the car. The sun was rising now, casting long shadows across the fields. And as we drove east, toward the place where the war had tested its darkest creations, I thought about Müller's final message. "Tell them we tried to stop it." I didn't know if anyone would listen, but I knew I had to try. Because that's what my grandfather would have wanted. Not vengeance, not justice, just the truth, even if it came 80 years too late. The land changed as we drove deeper east. Flatter, emptier. The trees grew sparse and the fields gave way to expanses of tall grass that moved in waves under the wind. There were no towns here, no roads really, just dirt tracks that disappeared into the horizon. This was the kind of place where things could happen and no one would ever know, where secrets could be buried and forgotten, where the earth itself became a grave. Clara stopped the car at the edge of a field. According to the map, this was it. The coordinates from the Soviet survey, the site of Facility 19. But there was nothing here. No buildings, no ruins, no markers, just grass. "Are you sure?" I asked. Clara checked the map again, then nodded. "This is it." We stepped out, the wind immediately cutting through our jackets. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something faint and chemical like old smoke. Clara walked forward slowly, her eyes scanning the ground. I followed, unsure what we were looking for, and then I saw it, a pattern in the grass, a circle maybe 50 meters across where nothing grew. The earth was darker here, almost black, scorched. Clara knelt beside the edge, running her fingers through the soil. "This is it," she said. "This is where they tested it." I looked around, my stomach turning. What happened here? Clara stood, staring at the center of the circle. They activated the device, and whatever it did, it burned the ground. How long ago? She shook her head. 80 years, but the Earth hasn't recovered. That's how much energy was released. I walked toward the center, my footsteps crunching on the brittle soil, and then I saw something glinting in the dirt. Metal. I knelt down, brushing away the soil. It was a piece of shrapnel. Small, twisted, covered in rust. But on one side, I could still see the markings. Project Nachthol. I held it up, the weight of it heavy in my hand. They tested it here, I said, and it worked. Clara walked over, taking the shrapnel from me. No, she said quietly, it didn't work. It exploded. She pointed to the edge of the circle. Look, the pattern is radial, outward from a central point. That's not a controlled resonance field. That's a catastrophic failure. I stared at the scorched earth. How many people were here? I don't know. But then Clara saw something at the far edge of the circle, a small depression in the ground. We walked over. It was a mass grave. Not marked, not maintained, just a long, shallow trench barely visible beneath the grass. Clara stood at the edge, her expression unreadable. They buried them here, she said, the ones who died in the test. How many? She didn't answer, just knelt down, pulling a small object from the dirt. A dog tag, German, rusted almost beyond recognition, but the name was still legible. Fischer, H., 1922. Heinrich Fischer, 21 years old, dead in a field no one remembered. Clara placed the dog tag carefully on the ground, then stood. There are more, she said. Dozens, probably. I looked at the trench, my throat tight. They were test subjects. Yes, and no one ever came for them. No. We stood in silence, the wind moving through the grass. I thought about the men on the train, the men in this grave, the men whose names had been erased from every record, every report, every memory. How many? 50? 100? And for what? A weapon that never worked. A project that consumed lives like fuel and produced nothing but ash. Why didn't they stop? I asked. After this, after it failed. Why keep going? Clara's voice was cold. Because stopping would mean admitting failure, and failure would mean someone had to be held responsible. She looked at me. So they buried the evidence, killed the witnesses, and moved on to the next project. I felt something harden inside me. We can't let this stay buried. No, she pulled out her camera, taking photographs of the scorched earth, the mass grave, the shrapnel. I walked back to the center of the circle, staring at the ground. This was where it had ended, not on the train, but here, in a field where no one would ever look. And I realized that the train had never been meant to arrive. It had been a decoy, a way to move the device without drawing attention, a way to dispose of the witnesses without raising questions. The men on that train had died, not because the device malfunctioned, but because it was always going to be destroyed, and they were part of the disposal. I felt sick. Clara walked over, placing a hand on my shoulder. "We need to go," she said, "before it gets dark." I nodded, taking one last look at the field, at the place where so many had died for nothing, and I thought about my grandfather, standing at the depot, watching the train leave, knowing where it was going, knowing what would happen, and knowing he could never tell anyone, because telling meant death, and silence meant survival. But survival came with a cost he paid every night for the rest of his life. We drove away as the sun began to set, the field disappearing behind us. But I knew it would never truly be gone, not from my mind, not from history. Some places are too heavy with the dead to ever be forgotten, even if no one remembers their names. We didn't go back to the hotel. Clara drove straight through the night, her eyes fixed on the road, her jaw tight. Something had shifted in her. I could see it in the way she held the steering wheel, the way her breathing had gone shallow. "Are you okay?" I asked. She didn't answer, just kept driving. Hours passed. The landscape blurred into darkness. And then, just before dawn, she pulled off the road into a rest area and stopped the car. Her hands were shaking. "Clara," I knew, she said, her voice barely audible. I stared at her. What? She turned to me, her eyes red. I knew about the grave. Before we went there. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? She exhaled, her breath trembling. I've been researching this for 5 years. I've read every document, every report, every fragment I could find. And 2 years ago I found a Soviet reconnaissance photograph, aerial, taken in 1944. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet. A photograph, grainy, black and white, but clear enough. It showed the field, the scorched circle, and at the edge, the trench, the mass grave. I knew it was there, she said. I knew men were buried there, and I didn't tell you. Why not? Her voice broke. Because I needed you to see it, to feel it. Because if I just told you, you wouldn't have believed it. You would have thought I was exaggerating, that I was chasing ghosts. She wiped her eyes. But I needed you to understand, to see what they did, to see what your grandfather carried. I sat in silence, my mind reeling. You used me. Yes. You manipulated me into going there. Yes. I felt anger rising in my chest. Why? Why not just show me the photograph? Why drag me across half of Europe to... Because it's not enough, she shouted, her voice cracking. It's not enough to see a photograph. It's not enough to read a report, because people don't care about documents. They care about stories. They care about people. She was crying now, her hands clenched into fists. I've been trying to tell this story for 5 years. I've written articles. I've contacted historians, journalists, governments, and no one cares, because it's not new, because the war is over, because the dead are dead and nothing will bring them back. She looked at me, her eyes desperate. But you have a connection. You have a name, a face, a grandfather who was there. And if you tell this story, people will listen, because it's not just history anymore, it's personal. I stared at her, my anger dissolving into something colder. You used my grandfather's memory. Yes, you used my grief. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but I didn't know what else to do. I opened the car door and stepped out, the cold air hitting me like a fist. I walked away, into the empty rest area, trying to process what she'd said. She'd known. She'd known about the grave, about the field, about everything, and she'd led me there like a puppet on strings. I felt used, betrayed. But beneath the anger, something else stirred, understanding, because I knew why she'd done it. I knew what it was like to carry a truth no one wanted to hear, to scream into the void and have no one answer. I thought about my grandfather, burning his notebook, waking up screaming, dying with the weight of silence still crushing him. And I thought about Müller, carving words into stone, leaving a message in a notebook he knew might never be read, dying for a truth the world refused to acknowledge. They had both tried, and both had failed, not because the truth wasn't important, but because no one was listening. I turned and walked back to the car. Clara was still sitting in the driver's seat, her head in her hands. I opened the door and sat down. I'm angry, I said. I know. I feel like you lied to me. I did. But I understand why. Her face streaked with tears. You do? I nodded. Because you're right. If you'd just shown me the photograph, I wouldn't have believed it. I would have thought it was just another war atrocity, another number in a history book. I paused. But I stood in that field. I held that dog tag. I saw the grave. I looked at her. And now I can't unsee it. Clara closed her eyes, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know. We sat in silence for a long time. The sun rose slowly, casting light across the empty parking lot, and I realized that this was the real cost of buried secrets. Not just the people who died, but the people left behind. The ones who spent their lives trying to unearth the truth, the ones who sacrificed everything, their credibility, their relationships, their sanity, just to make someone, anyone, listen. Clara had been carrying this alone for 5 years, and she was breaking. Just like my grandfather had broken, just like Müller had broken, because the weight of silence is heavier than the weight of death. What do we do now? I asked. Clara wiped her eyes, taking a deep breath. We finish it. We write the story. We publish everything we've found. And if no one listens, she looked at me, her eyes hard. Then at least we tried. At least we didn't stay silent. She paused. At least we didn't let them win. I nodded slowly. Okay. She started the engine, and we drove back toward the city, toward the end of this journey, toward whatever came next. And as the landscape blurred past, I thought about the story we were going to tell. Not a story about heroes or villains, but a story about people. People who tried to stop something terrible. People who failed. People who died in silence. And people who refused to let that silence be the final word. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes, something is enough. We returned to Berlin 3 days later, exhausted, haunted, but resolute. Clara's apartment became our war room. Documents spread across every surface, photographs pinned to the walls, timelines scrawled on whiteboards. We worked for days, piecing together the narrative, not just the facts, but the human story beneath them. The men who had designed the bell, the men who had tried to stop it, the men who had died because of it, and the men who had survived, carrying the weight of it for the rest of their lives. Clara wrote, I organized. Together we built something that felt true, not because we could prove every detail, but because we could prove enough. Enough to show that Project Nachthol had existed, enough to show that men had died testing a weapon that never worked, enough to show that the truth had been buried, deliberately and systematically, and enough to show that my grandfather had been there, a witness, a survivor, a man who had chosen silence over truth because truth would have killed him. One night, as we worked late, Clara looked up from her laptop. Do you think he would have wanted this? She asked. Your grandfather. Do you think he would have wanted us to tell his story? I thought about it for a long time. I don't know, I said finally. I think part of him died when he burned that notebook. I think he decided the truth was too dangerous. I paused. But I also think he kept the photograph. He wrote clues. Those lines in the notebook before he destroyed the rest. He didn't erase everything. I looked at Clara. I think he wanted someone to find it, someday, when it was safe. Do you think it's safe now? I shrugged. Safer than it was. The war is over. The people who gave the orders are dead. The systems that protected the secret are gone. I leaned back. But I think safety isn't the point anymore. I think the point is that the truth deserves to exist, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's painful. Clara nodded slowly. My mother used to say that history is written by the survivors, not the victors, the survivors. She smiled sadly. She was a historian too. She spent her life researching the Holocaust, interviewing survivors, recording their stories before they were lost. What happened to her? She died 5 years ago. Cancer. Clara looked down at her hands. Before she died, the dead don't need justice. They're gone. But the living need truth, because without truth we're just repeating the same mistakes. She looked up at me. That's why I do this. Not for the dead. For us. So we don't forget what we're capable of. I felt something settle in my chest. A sense of purpose. Not vengeance, not anger, just clarity. This was why we were here. Not to punish anyone, but to remember, to bear witness, to make sure the silence didn't win. We finished the article 2 weeks later, 9,000 words, 10 chapters, every detail sourced, every claim documented. We sent it to 3 major publications. 2 rejected it immediately. Not enough public interest, one editor said. Too niche, said another, but the third, a German investigative journalism outlet, accepted it. They fact-checked it for 2 months, reached out to archivists, historians, government officials, verified every document, and then they published it. The response was mixed. Some people praised it, called it important, necessary. Others dismissed it, said it was ancient history, irrelevant. A few accused us of fabricating evidence, of chasing conspiracy theories. But there were others, people who reached out quietly. A woman in Poland whose grandfather had been on the train. A man in Ukraine whose family had lived near the testing site. a researcher in Moscow who had found similar documents in the Soviet archives. They thanked us, not for solving anything, but for listening, for refusing to let the silence continue. And slowly, the story began to spread, not viral, not explosive, but steady, like a river cutting through stone, one person at a time, one memory at a time. Clara and I stayed in touch after the article was published. We didn't work on another project together, but we became friends, bound by the strange intimacy of shared grief. I went back to my life, my job, my routines. But something had changed. I couldn't look at history the same way anymore. Couldn't read about the war without thinking about the spaces between the lines, the stories that were never told, the people who were erased. And I thought about my grandfather often, not with sadness, but with understanding. He had done what he could. He had survived. He had carried the weight. And in the end, he had left just enough behind for someone to find. That was his victory. Not speaking, but ensuring that someday, someone would. One night I took the photograph out again, the one from the envelope. My grandfather standing beside the train, hands in his pockets, eyes on the camera, and for the first time I didn't see a ghost. I saw a man, flawed, scared, complicit in ways he probably hated, but human, trying to navigate an impossible situation with impossible choices. And I realized that's what this story had always been about. Not heroes, not villains, just people, caught in the machinery of war, trying to survive, trying to do the right thing, and failing, because sometimes the right thing doesn't exist. Sometimes there are only choices and the burden of living with them. I placed the photograph back in its envelope, but I didn't put it away. I kept it on my desk, a reminder, not of the war, but of the cost of silence and the importance of speaking, even when no one is listening, especially when no one is listening. The package arrived on a Tuesday, no return address, just my name and a postmark from Ukraine. Inside was a small wooden box, carefully wrapped in cloth, and a letter. The handwriting was shaky, the English broken, but the meaning was clear. My grandfather was Heinrich Fischer. He died in the field. You wrote about him. Thank you. This belonged to him. I want you to have it. I opened the box slowly. Inside was a small tarnished medal, German, military, and beneath it, a photograph. A young man in uniform, smiling. Heinrich Fischer, 21 years old. I sat at my desk, holding the photograph, and I felt something break open inside me. This was real, not just a name in a report, not just a dog tag in the dirt, a person, a life, a future stolen, and someone, 80 years later, wanted the world to know he had existed. I placed the photograph beside the one of my grandfather. 2 men, 2 wars, 2 stories, connected by silence, and by the refusal of a few people to let that silence be the end. I wrote back to the sender, thanked them, told them their grandfather's story mattered, that I would make sure it wasn't forgotten. And then I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened my grandfather's notebook, the one he had tried to burn, the one Müller had written in, and I read the final line again. Tell them we tried to stop it. I picked up a pen, and beneath it, in my own handwriting, I wrote, they know. We told them. It wasn't much, just a few words in a yellowed notebook that no one else would ever read, but it felt important. Like closing a circle, like keeping a promise. The world didn't change after our article was published. The dead didn't come back. The war didn't unhappen, but something shifted, small, imperceptible. A few more people knew the truth. A few more names were remembered. A few more ghosts were given voice. And maybe that's all we can ever do. Not rewrite history, but add to it. Fill in the blanks. Speak for those who couldn't. I think about the train sometimes, the convoy that vanished in 1943, 43 men sent into the dark with a weapon that didn't work and orders that didn't matter. I think about the field, the scorched earth where the testing happened, the grave that no one marked, the lives erased from every record. And I think about my grandfather, standing at the depot, watching the train leave, knowing, always knowing, carrying it like a wound that never healed. But I also think about Clara, about the 5 years she spent chasing fragments, about the moment she broke down in the car, admitting she'd manipulated me, about the way she kept going anyway, because some truths are worth the cost. And I think about Miller carving words into stone, writing in a notebook that would be burned, dying for a secret he'd tried to destroy. They all tried, in their own ways, with the tools they had, in the circumstances they were given. They tried to stop the silence, and maybe they failed, but the echo of their voices is still here. Faint, fragile, but real. I keep the photographs on my desk now. My grandfather, Heinrich Fischer, 2 men who never met, but whose lives were tangled together by a machine that ate people and produced nothing but ash. Sometimes I wonder what they would say to each other, if they could speak across the years, across the silence. Maybe nothing. Maybe there are no words for what they endured, but I like to think they would understand each other, the way survivors always do, not through explanations, but through recognition, through the shared weight of having seen something terrible, and having lived anyway. I don't know if our story mattered in the grand scheme of things. I don't know if anyone will remember it in another 80 years, but I know it mattered to the woman in Poland who wrote to thank us. It mattered to the man in Ukraine who sent me his grandfather's medal. It mattered to Clara, who finally felt heard after 5 years of screaming into the void. And it mattered to me, because I understand my grandfather now, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to know that he wasn't a coward. He was a man trying to survive an impossible situation. A man who chose silence because speaking would have killed him. A man who left just enough behind for someone, someday, to find the truth. And we found it. Not all of it, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to say, this happened. These people existed. Their deaths mattered. Their silence had a reason. And now, finally, they can rest. Because the story has been told, not the way they would have told it, not the way history books will remember it, but in the only way that matters, honestly, completely, without apology. The war ended in 1945, but the ghosts didn't. They stayed, haunting the fields and the depots and the archives, waiting for someone to listen, and we did, and now their voices are part of the record. Faint echoes in a world that has mostly moved on, but echoes nonetheless. And as long as someone is listening, they will never truly be gone. I close the notebook and place it back in the drawer. Beside it, the photographs. Beside them, the medal, artifacts of lives lived and lost, stories buried and unearthed, secrets kept and finally told. The silence is broken now, and in its place something fragile but true. Memory. Some truths are not lost. They are buried, and they wait for someone brave enough to dig, for someone stubborn enough to listen, and when they are finally found, they change nothing and everything all at once. The dead remain dead, but the living remember, and in that remembering there is a kind of justice, not loud, not satisfying, but real. The Convoy vanished in 1943, but the story did not. It lived. In whispers, in fragments, in the nightmares of a man who survived, and now it lives here. In these words, for anyone who will listen, the war ended, the ghosts didn't.